Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be just talking about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's going to be a bit shorter than usual because essentially my life is a little bit chaotic right now, mostly good things. Essentially I'm just as I'm recording this, in the last week of my job, about to move to another job. So all kinds of here, there and everywhere. And it's been very much one of those weeks where, you know, someone will text and be like, hey, are we still meeting on Wednesday? And I'll be like, that's something that was not in my calendar. So if imagine that, just this week has just been a lot, and hence my reading has been largely confined to a couple of audiobooks, which I've been reading a lot while listening to a lot while walking this lovely dog, who will probably re-emerge at some point. And then one physical book that I read, which is a short one, which kind of then it makes sense with that, which is Riambel by Priya, Hein. So let's get started on the books that I read this week. So, as I just mentioned, Riambel by Priya, Hein is a book that I read this week, and I just really enjoyed this. I did a separate video on it, so wider sort of a wider sort of lens on it, or I don't know if that makes sense. A more in-depth look is there, but essentially this is a really rather short book that deals with a young woman, Naomi, who lives in Riambel in Mauritius. And she is sort of trying to navigate things as a fairly young girl and sort of young woman, just trying to live in a world where sort of local Mauritian people are often positioned as sort of somewhat second-class citizens, or in kind of service-style positions to often white, often wealthy people coming in externally. So, for example, people, she might work in the house of someone who has all this money and can afford this house, and she'll be there as a cleaner or some kind of servant or cook or something, and in that kind of capacity, along with her mother, trying to really make ends meet while the sort of people around her have these really extravagant lives by comparison. And that sort of builds this sort of sense of resentment that appears in parts of the book, but also there's a really crystal clear way that this book approaches so many other things in terms of really sort of taking these big ideas around colonialism and disparity and so many other things and sort of boiling them down into something really quite profound. So this book deals a lot with those interactions between people, particularly when Naomi sort of starts to quite like a sort of local guy who's quite, I say local, a white guy who's sort of living in one of these very expensive places. So not only that kind of angle on it, but also there's this really beautiful way that this book does some clever and inventive things. So for example, it has recipes littered throughout the book, which are not only interesting in their own right, but also do this really interesting thing where sort of by peppering them through the book, no pun intended, there is a way that extra points can sort of be made about some of these things. So it's not just a recipe, it's actually a recipe, you know, that one of them might be a recipe that talks about adapting this for local, for sort of people coming in and being from elsewhere. And that kind of, in that way, the menu and the recipe talks about something much bigger than itself. Or it might talk about local ingredients, but actually you can't get this ingredient anymore, so you've got to do this. And there are just these really subtle ways that the book does these very clever things, I think, that I just found really fascinating. So without going into another 10-minute discussion about why I love this book, I think it's just a really interesting read, and given that my brain has not really been with it this week, was it kind of the perfect salve for a lot of that. Next up, I read A Spell of Good Things by bámi Adébáyọ. And this I thought was quite an interesting book and kind of quite a nice sort of, I say nice, there's a lot of kind of quite dark stuff that happens, but a really interesting sort of family tale in many ways. And so it deals largely with this family and a lot of how they sort of really think about sort of some of the things around them. So for example, the young kids in the family are constantly struggling to have the school fees to be able to kind of attend school fully. And so for them, that makes them social outcasts. It can kind of lead to a situation where they never quite feel ready. But actually at the same time, we get this sort of parents' perspective of them trying to make ends meet to get the money. And as we often see in this book, people do quite extreme things to try and get some of that money. And, you know, at one point we sort of start looking at this sort of underworld of pickpocketing and pretending to be sort of disabled in order to beg, on the streets and things like that, where there's this sort of these really moral quandaries thrown up by the book, where people do wrong things to make money, to make ends meet, just so they can make that, support their family. And so these kinds of conversations happen quite a lot, where is that justified if by doing so you're breaking the cycle of poverty, or you're breaking other sort of cycles to get your kid to school, to do all these other things. But it explores it in such an interesting way, where these sort of so much is woven into how this story approaches so many other discussions. There are these really warm moments of sort of the family coming together. There are these really hostile moments where people are kind of at each other's throats. It's quite an interesting, just sort of very beautiful family sort of saga in many ways, that I just greatly enjoyed. It's maybe not going to be one of my top books of the year, but it was something that I really greatly enjoyed and was a nice sort of soothing book in some ways to listen to. And I say soothing, there are some passages that are definitely not soothing, but yeah, a really, really interesting book nonetheless. And last but not least, I read China in 10 Words by Yu Hua. And this is translated by Allan H. Barr. And what I found kind of quite interesting about this book is the way it sort of takes sort of quite a narrative approach to nonfiction. So it is largely the idea of, as the sort of story, as the title seems to suggest, trying to tell the history and story of China using 10 sort of big words that are, have been incredibly popular or incredibly poignant in some way. So, one of those words might just be, for example, people, and that sort of leads into a wider discussion around how the people of China view themselves within the sort of wider sort of country. But equally, there is the word copycat that comes up, and there's this really interesting sort of discussion of, for example, counterfeit goods, or kind of the way that like kind of having, I don't know, for example, a product called like Samsung instead of Samsung, right? Or kind of like a knockoff brand, and how the kind of the way that is viewed is maybe different to how we would view it. So we would sort of, the way we look at sort of intellectual property, or the way we look at various other things in the UK, for example, might be radically different there. And so this kind of idea of copycat, Yu Hua is sort of trying to really break down this idea that it's not quite as clear cut as just this is counterfeit, this is not counterfeit. There's actually sort of more of a blurred line of where that culturally sits, and where for some people certain things are okay to kind of copycat and other things are not. And so as a result, it sort of does this sort of history of China, particularly the sort of Great Leap Forward kind of and sort of Mao Zedong era. So it's a really quite fascinating book, and sort of one that I found kind of by accident while I was just looking through sort of Libby or BorrowBox or something. And I was just like, sure, why not? So that's what I ended up reading. And I realised that's been an incredibly short one of me talking about this week. I'm currently reading Carla by Colin Walsh, which I'm loving, and I will talk about next week. I was hoping to sort of have finished it in time for this video, but no. But I am loving it so far. I'm about over halfway through, and I think Carla is going to be one of those reads that's up there. Also, I'm just a sucker for Irish dialect and Irish accents, as I keep finding during the audiobook experience of this book. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker. I hope you're having a great week. I hope your reading is going well. I'd love to hear what you're reading at the moment. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.